Hello, my name is Rebecca Esterson, and I am coming to you from Berkeley, California. I'm so honored to have been invited to be a part of this series of events celebrating Helen Keller's legacy of love. Um, I am a white woman with shoulder-length brown curly hair. I'm wearing a dark pink blazer, and I'm sitting in front of my bookshelf here in my office with the California sunshine coming in through the window. Um, I thought that I would present this for this series something on Helen Keller and romantic love and her love affair. So I'm going to be presenting some research that I have been working on with a co-author, Megan Leveridge, who is a scholar of American religious history. Dr. Leveridge and I have been working on a religious biography of Helen Keller for the religious biography series put out by Eerdmans Publishing. So what I'm presenting today is from our chapter 3 for that book. I'll be speaking on themes of love and beauty and marriage through the story of Helen Keller's love affair with a man named Peter Fagan. I'll also be speaking on the theme of eugenics, or the science of controlling reproduction in a given population for the sake of altering the gene pool. These are two themes that are intertwined in our story for today and cannot really be told separately from one another. They are themes that play out in Helen Keller's life, especially in her mid-30s. And that's what I'll be focusing on today, that part of her life. And they're themes that would impact the rest of her life, as we'll see. So if we think about Helen Keller's understanding of love, we have to go back to her childhood in Tuscumbia, Alabama, where she was taught language by her teacher, Anne Sullivan, using finger spelling in the palm of her hand. This is a very familiar story to a lot of people. So she would be taught word by word through finger spelling and through experiencing the world around her language. But when it came to the word love, it was a little abstract, and there was nothing that Anne Sullivan could point to concretely to help Helen understand what it would mean when she would say, "I love you, Helen." Helen would have questions. Well, what is this love? And she would imagine things around her and say, is this love? Is this love? And it's interesting that on a few occasions, at least, she wondered if the feeling of the warmth of the sun on her skin, if that's what love was, that she was drawn to the sun, the warmth of the sun on her skin. And eventually, when she did come to understand this word, love, she writes, "The beautiful truth burst upon my mind. I felt that there were invisible lines stretched between my spirit and the spirit of others." So, not unlike the rays of the sun, Keller is experiencing the connection, the warmth, the lines between people with this idea of love. And we like to think that this is anticipating the idea of the spiritual sun that is found in Swedenborgian theology. Helen would be a Swedenborgian Christian from her teens into old age and until the time of her death. And Swedenborgian theology comes with this idea of the spiritual sun, or that the light and heat of our natural sun corresponds to love and wisdom from God. And these two things, love and wisdom, are merged or married in God and in all of us to the extent that they are in balanced harmony. So love and wisdom is experienced like the heat and the light of the sun. And it's compared to the marriage between lover and beloved. Wisdom and love from God are like these two things from the sun. Later in her life, again, we're going to zip ahead to the mid-30s. In a June 9th, 1916 issue of the Chicago Daily Tribune, Author Harriet Farrell reported on an exclusive interview with Helen Keller. In it, she outlines Keller's unique opinions about marriage, which Keller had spelled out eagerly and with great amusement as their conversation unfolded. Keller expressed her views that all women should marry, if they're able to, for the sake of the evolution of the world, and that marriage should be an equal partnership, akin to a bicameral government. So a husband and wife would form a Congress and a Senate of the family, and they would participate in complementary roles regarding various economic, social functions of the family. When asked what she was looking for in a husband, Keller assured her interviewer that her prospects were plentiful. She had multiple proposals, she says, and one especially attentive suitor. She was proud to be able to provide financially for herself and required neither money nor education in a husband. Perhaps her future spouse, she mused, would be like her good friend Mark Twain, who was self-educated, quote, humanly tender, yet strong and full of humor, she says. However, the description of her potential beloved came with one strange line, a strange description that has baffled future readers of this article. Of course, she writes, or she says, he will be handsome for eugenic reasons. This is a line that has been quite concerning and confusing to Keller's readers since in that time and ever since. A few months earlier, Keller had waded into the controversy of the science of eugenics when she published a position piece on the so-called Bollinger baby affair. This was a piece responding to the decision on the part of Dr. Harry Haselden, who had refused to perform life-saving operations on a baby who was born paralyzed with a curved spine and other body differences. Keller wrote in support of this decision on the part of the doctor to not provide medical intervention for this baby. And she wrote in this piece, it is the possibilities of happiness, intelligence, and power that give life its sanctity, and they are absent in the case of a poor, misshapen, paralyzed, unthinking creature. Difficult words for Keller's followers to understand, coming from someone who was an advocate for the disabled her whole life. And it has complicated her legacy in the generations since her life. Even though later published pieces reverse this position, that piece in particular is the focus of much critique of Keller and her legacy. Eugenics was widely deliberated at this time in the years leading up to the Second World War, even though it would become unthinkable after the horrors of the Second World War. Nevertheless, in the decades prior to it and in this time period in particular, it was widely discussed and debated. It was especially prevalent in the socialist literature of the 1910s and the 1920s, and Keller herself was an avid reader of this literature, where she would find opinions that the working poor in particular were burdened by disability, and that working women, the poor women and children were the people who ended up bearing the burden, and that human progress depended on this kind of eugenic activity. So this was a view present in the literature that Helen Keller was reading at the time. It is also important to understand the impact of Alexander Graham Bell on Keller's views here. Alexander Graham Bell is someone with a very complicated legacy in the disability world. He famously believed that deaf people should not marry other deaf people. And was a proponent of certain forms of eugenics related to this. He nevertheless told Keller multiple points in her life that because her deafness and her blindness were not genetic, that she should be encouraged to marry. And this was, again, said to her multiple times in her life. So there's a complicated narrative in Keller's world, being in the multiple sources of information that she's taking in. Alexander Graham Bell's protege, Anne Sullivan, would, of course, become Keller's teacher, and Sullivan would herself express views along these lines that would come to inform Keller's sense of self. In fact, in remembering her first impression of the child, Helen Keller, Sullivan writes of the beauty, that she was struck by Keller's physical beauty. And she writes, "I noticed that her body was well formed and sturdy. For this I was most thankful. If she had been deformed or had acquired any of those nervous habits that so often accompany blindness, and which make such an assemblage of blind people such a pitiful sight, how much harder it would have been for me." So here we have the view expressed, and the view that certainly would have been expressed to Keller, that her physical beauty and her physical strength were to be celebrated, and that somehow countered her disability, creating a kind of complicated sense of self. And while certainly her eugenic stance, as we find in that printed piece, was not supported by her Swedenborgian faith, we do find views about beauty and the correspondence between outer beauty and inner beauty that would have fallen in line maybe with some of the messaging she was getting from Anne Sullivan and from Alexander Graham Bell. In particular, after Helen Keller's father died, she was sent by John Hitz, who was the man who introduced her to Swedenborgianism. She was sent this little pamphlet. We have a copy in our library here in Berkeley. This little story published as a pamphlet. I don't know if you can see it. The Immortal Fountain. This beautifully bound, very short story that was sent to her, it seems, in support of an idea of a beautiful afterlife, that her father had entered into a world of beauty. But it's a story of two sisters, one who is beautiful and full of grace and virtue, and the other sister who is not beautiful and who is resentful of her sister, and her resentment manifests in her body in a way that makes her ugly. And it's the story of these two sisters, and the beautiful, virtuous sister develops the ability to see into the spiritual world, to see into the world of angels and humans who have passed into the afterlife. And so the beautiful sister is walking around in these beautiful gardens and meeting these beautiful angels. And the ugly sister is jealous and tries to go and meet with these same angels, but is unable to. And eventually a guide comes and explains to her that it's because of her kind of inner ugliness, and she needs to develop her virtues. And she does so, and over time she becomes more virtuous, and as she becomes more virtuous, she becomes more beautiful, and is eventually able to see with inner sight, with spiritual sight, into this other realm. So one just imagines how this story might have impacted Keller, for whom spiritual sight was so important, and for whom it seems her physical beauty was a saving feature in the view of those around her. So it is our belief and our argument in our book that all of this created a kind of internalized ableism that would complicate her views on eugenics and on romantic love, but that would also eventually come to complicate her one chance at marriage, or at least the one chance that we know about. So we have to tell the story of Mr. Peter Fagin in order to complete this chapter. So Peter Fagin was born in 1890, 10 years after Keller. He was 10 years younger. Was born to an Irish Catholic mother and a Quaker father, raised on a farm in Holly, Michigan. And he would eventually go on to study at the University of Michigan. He would study law. He developed an interest in Unitarianism, maybe because of the diversity of his parents' religions. Unitarianism was very attractive to him. And on weekends, while he was at university, he would be hired to preach at churches around Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he earned money that way. While he was at university, he was also a member of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, and he would become very active in the Socialist Party. In the summer of 1913, this is a very interesting story about him. He and his friends would kind of hide away on a train without paying. They boarded this train secretly and traveled to Florida, where, with no money, just having an adventure, college kids, they would land in Florida and occupy an abandoned church. And there they decided to try out a sociological experiment. On Sundays, they would preach and they would hold services in this abandoned church, but they would be preaching the words of revolutionary socialists, such as Eugene Debs, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and others. And their services became quite popular, and so much so that they started being invited by Protestant preachers around Florida to come and guest preach in their churches. But eventually their scheme was discovered, that they had taken over this abandoned church and that they were doing this, and they were kicked out of the church, and they went back to school. Eventually, after graduating, Fagin moved north and started working as a journalist for the Boston Herald. And that's where he met a Mr. John Macy. John Macy was the husband of Anne Sullivan. She would be Anne Sullivan Macy was her married name. And John Macy worked with Fagin at the Boston Herald. John Macy was also a socialist and very active in socialist circles. And so this is part of the political environment that Keller was drawn into at the time. So Macy hired Peter Fagin to assist Keller, to be on her team, her staff. Keller had a team of people who would help her with her correspondence, reading and writing, which she did very actively, especially while Keller was traveling. She needed people to assist her in this way, and Fagin was hired on to do this. And as part of the job, he learned to fingerspell so that the two of them could communicate independently and privately. And this private relationship between them develops over the years into a romantic one. Precisely at the time of Keller's interview with the Chicago Tribune that was mentioned earlier, 1916, the summer of 1916, it was exactly at this time that Fagin confessed his feelings of love to Keller and proposed marriage, promising to care for her for the rest of her life. This was in the summer of 1916. It wasn't until later that fall, in November, that they were found out. How were they found out? Butler in the house saw them kissing and went and told Keller's mother about this. It's important to remember that Keller was 36 years old at this time. Fagin was 26. So she was a fully grown, independent woman, independent with her staff supporting her, but she was 36 years old. And as soon as this love affair was uncovered, her mother and Anne Sullivan, her beloved teacher, conspired to end it. They wanted this to end immediately. At the same time that they were caught in romantic entanglements, as it were, the Boston newspapers began publishing evidence of a marriage license, that Fagin and Keller had together applied for a marriage license. We have Helen Keller's signature on the application, so we know that she was involved in an application for a marriage license, and that the two of them planned to elope. They had plans to elope to Florida. Again, we can think of Fagin's antics there earlier in his college days, but that he had connections in Florida and he knew clergy people there. He had friends who could marry them. And Florida was interesting to them also because there were eugenics laws on the books in various states that restricted who could marry and who could not marry based on their disabilities. And in some states, women had to have a health examination in order to have enough evidence that they were healthy enough to marry. Florida did not have these laws, so it was a place where they knew they could marry without any legal trouble. And again, they had friends there who could support them. So long story short, they had planned a quite elaborate elopement involving trains. Helen was headed to Alabama with her mother, who had found out about this and was trying to take Keller home and protect her from this man. And Fagin planned to kind of meet her there and get her on another train to Florida. And so they had this elaborate plan that didn't end up working out. We do know that they tried again. They were spotted together on the family's porch, the porch of the house in Alabama, with their bags ready to go. Helen's sister saw this and called her husband to come with gun in hand and scare Fagin off at gunpoint. A few days later, her sister Mildred found Helen on the porch with her bags alone, waiting for Fagin to return, which he did not return. So after multiple attempts, their planned elopement did not happen. We don't know exactly what the motive of Keller's family or Anne Sullivan was in denying Keller at the age of 36 this marriage. We can speculate, and given the climate in which marriage with someone who has disabilities was illegal in many places in the country, and also their own sense of needing to protect her possibly from whatever threat they saw in Fagin. The Selma Times suggested in an article about this that marriage would challenge Keller's angel-like status. Quote, "Miss Keller is idealized by the American people almost as a spiritual prodigy. If married, she would lose something of the hallowed association that her name invokes." So her plans to marry were foiled. And she writes about this later in life. She writes a book called Midstream in 1929, and she reflects on what happened and writes in very glowing and beautiful terms about her love for Peter. She writes, "His love was a bright sun." There's that image of the sun. "His love was a bright sun that shone upon my helplessness and isolation." She writes, "For a brief space, I danced in and out of the gates of heaven, wrapped in a web of bright imaginings." So again, the sun as an image and metaphor for love here is present in her remembering this time. She also writes, "The brief love will remain in my life, a little island of joy surrounded by dark waters. I'm glad to have experienced being loved and desired. The fault was not in the loving, but in the circumstances. A lovely thing tried to express itself, but the conditions were not right or adequate, and it never blossomed. Yet the failure perhaps only serves to set off the beauty of the intention. I see it all now with a heart that has grown sad in growing wiser." Her midlife reflections on the affair, in the sense that she defends those who put an end to it, including her mother and Anne Sullivan Macy. And these were people who she loved deeply in another way. And she does try to understand their motivations. Uh, One wonders, however, and in writing this book, we have really been contemplating whether or not her public stance on eugenics, which she made known just a few months prior to this attempted elopement, if that public stance would become private, turned finally against herself. In reflecting in the same book, Midstream, on Alexander Graham Bell's early encouragement regarding a future marriage, Keller would write, "I feel less inclined than ever to embark on the great adventure, marriage. I have fully made up my mind that a man and woman must be equally equipped to weather successfully the vicissitudes of life. It would be a severe handicap to any man to saddle upon him the dead weight of my infirmities. I know I have nothing to give a man that would make up for such an unnatural burden." The sadness and regret and despondency expressed in those lines, we argue, should be understood as internalized ableism, an internalizing of such positions as were in circulation, both in among those in her close orbit, but also in the world around her at the time. So in our book, we utilize the concept of crib time, which is a concept found in disability studies, to explain the way that people with disabilities experience life events, life timelines, time in general, uniquely, in ways different than others. And we compare this in our book to the Swedenborgian idea of angel time, or that one's inner angel nature experiences time uniquely according to the state and the circumstances that are unique to an individual. For Keller, her timeline extended into the afterlife, and we contemplate what it might mean from the lens of crib time, that one's timeline might extend into the afterlife or into eternity. Reflecting in her journal, this is different than the midlife publication. In her private journal, she reflects on the ableist context, 1938, in which people with disabilities were discouraged and sometimes banned from romantic love. And Keller reflects and finds hope in her Swedenborgian faith that she might one day still marry in the afterlife, in heaven. She writes, "What earthly consolation is there for one like me, whom fate has denied a husband and the joy of motherhood? At the moment, my loneliness seems a void that will always be immense. Fortunately, I have much work to do, more than ever before, in fact. And while doing it, I shall have the confidence, as always, that my unfulfilled longing will be gloriously satisfied in a world where eyes never grow dim, nor ears dull." So we suggest that in her 30s, we find that the ableism of her context got tangled up with the confidence that she had in her own abilities, and that the mixed messages in the world around her would become internalized messages that were conflicting and complicated. But hers is not a tragic story. Keller's story is not a tragic one, even though there were these moments of despondency, regret, sadness. Keller would go on, leaving behind the troubling views expressed in her piece on the Bollinger Affair, to be an advocate for the disabled on the world stage. She would speak out against the eugenics practices of Hitler's Nazi Germany in explicit terms. And her concern for the social conditions that limited those with disabilities would motivate a life of activism for adjacent populations. So the disabled, but also populations that were adjacent to disability and were restricted for similar reasons, including advocacy for racial minorities, for women, for the working poor, and for soldiers who had been injured in war. We like to imagine that whoever she may have found and married in the afterlife, her advocacy for those of us still wandering on this earth continues in some way. Thank you.